It's a great pleasure to introduce Brandon LaBelle, our, I want to say speaker, but actually I should say co-creator of the input, maybe, or Brandon is artist, writer, and theorist, working with questions, working with actually culture, sound, voice, and questions of agency. And Brandon is grappling with questions of sound production in public space, and also he is a present guest researcher at EHAS in Brussels, the Mestre, and Hongru, that are present here, the Song School. And also Brandon is a professor in art, design, and music faculty at the Bergen University. And last but not the least, I should say that Brandon is a man who believes in the power of you. I learned this morning.
Yeah, this is already a bit too many.
Yeah, you're too many, but well, it's okay.
It's okay.
So please join in welcoming Brandon.
Thank you, Gediminas. Such a pleasure to be here and to engage in the whole swamp activity. As Gediminas already suggested or pointed out, I'm working primarily as an artist and as a writer, and focusing very much on sound for some years now. But I guess I could say that sound is a very broad framework, both in terms of a kind of artistic material or an artistic opportunity, but also as a sort of research framework. So I guess for myself this immediately leads to the primary question about listening. So I guess I will focus on this for today. So the question of sound, I would say quite immediately seems to require another type of thinking. We could already say that sound is quite an abstraction, inspiring another way of understanding and also relating to things around us. So what I'd like to do here is to speculate on what this other type of thinking could be, to fundamentally also reimagine a relationship to what is around us, and also, of course, to each other, according to experiences of sound and listening. So this will lead to exploring what sound is, what we might understand it to be, how it behaves, and what it might suggest also in terms of what we might call community life. So to start, I want to consider fundamentally what happens to the body when we listen and how sound locates us as subjects. The question might be, what type of body does sound create? And what might such a body suggest in terms of a kind of ethics of how we live together? So first I want to start with a fundamental understanding of sound, what we can think of as its defining characteristic, that of propagation. A movement, an agitation is always constituting sound. So to deepen this idea, I might of course start with a sound. So I really wanted to knock on this table, but I'm not really sure with this sensitive. Maybe that's better. This sound here, we could say, brings our attention to the object. I tap on the table, and we all turn here to the table. Even though, of course, this sound is already moving away from the object, it still refers us to the table. The sound we hear announces this object here. Maybe it's a kind of punctuation. So we might already start by emphasizing that sound is a type of friction between two bodies. Two things coming into contact a type of intersection. For instance, we do not only hear the table, but of course we also hear my hand as it taps the table. The hand and the table are brought together in this sound. In fact, this sound is constituted by the material agitation of these two things as they meet, as they confront one another. I would not necessarily call this a conversation, rather a kind of primary contact, literally bumping into each other, maybe what we could think of as a force of relation. In this regard, sounds are the result of an event between two or more. I might already say it is a kind of assembly, though maybe we can talk about that. Can we think of this sound then as the combination or intersection of these two things? The event of their meeting, their being forced into each other. Might we think of this sound then as no longer the table or the hand, but both together? An expression of singularities meeting, blending, commingling. You can follow this understanding of sound a bit further. This event of sound is also one that works to leave behind the original object, to depart from the concept of origin. For instance, the sound we hear actually works by distributing the object, animating it, moving it from here to there, from this place to another, passing it around. I would suggest that through a focus on sound, the table is no longer here, but over there. It is here and then already somewhere else. Sound, in other words, is defined as sound because it gives animation or expression to this rather ambiguous event of things meeting. The folds of the skin that vibrate the voice, the body contacting the material world around it, the force of so many elements meeting, displacing, and replacing particular assemblies to circulate, to travel away, and quite possibly to function as a kind of meta-materiality. Sound, in short, becomes its own object, a kind of ghost or transmutation, object becoming energy, and one that aligns here and there. An object constituted by relations, by a more than one. Where does this sound go then? Where does this sound end up as it departs from one place to arrive at another? I would say, of course, on some level, it goes into our listening. It brings this event, this table, this hand, from here and then into my body. It enters my ears, it vibrates my skin to travel into my perception, my understanding, as well as my imagination. In this way, the table and the hand inhabit my body. We might say that the sound is already inside, even while remaining exterior. It is a kind of thrust of animation that also trespasses. It is always realigning relations, forcing another kind of construct. Sound can have such a forceful presence. It breaks into us, it ruptures the surface. It is immediately a transgression of borders. It doesn't stay put. It springs upon us. I'm pressed by sound, washed over by its movements. There is nowhere to hide. Following these ideas, I would suggest that sound is the making of what we could call a relational body. First, this begins already with the act of two or more things meeting. A hand and a table, for example, coming into contact, forced together. What we hear then is a relational event, sound as the constitution of more than one. In this regard, sound is a type of composite, I might even call it a mutant, expressed as the intensity of a togetherness, interrupted, resonant, vibratory. Sound might be the flexing of this togetherness, the animation of this mutant. Of course, this kind of mutant, this construct, also this assembly, must also include not only the propagation of the event, moving from here to there, but also, of course, its reverberation as well. These sounds that leave the table come to interact with its given acoustical surroundings. Sound is a kind of collection of so many frictions and contacts. The philosopher Mladen Dolar gives a rather suggestive account of listening in his article, The Phonetic Burrow. Following a reading of Kafka's short story, The Bureau, Dolar highlights a deep ambiguity to sound. It is enigmatic, he says, and aligned with the dark, with the absence of a concrete, knowable reference. Where is this sound coming from? And yet, in a way, we assume its origin. We actually try to pin it down. We hear something outside and we understand it as being connected to a particular object or event. We locate it, we fix it back to origin in order to contend with what we do not know, with the mutant. Yet sound is essentially freeing itself from reference. It is shuttling between acoustical matter and a kind of acousmatic impression. We move in and out of knowing for certain this sound that we hear. Secondly, moving through the topic of relationality, the event of sound also relates to us then as listeners. This sound brings me into its event. It in a way engulfs me, looping me into its propagations and its reverberations. I can't stand outside. It already immerses us, thereby relating all that it gathers in its movements to a listener, to my body. I hear not only a single sound, but a sound as a composite of relationships to which I am fully integrated, I am collected. In this sense, the assembly of sound, its relationality, is also prone to a type of impersonality, a form of crowd, a crowdedness. Finally, the relational body of sound is also never only for me. Rather, of course, it relates us to something beyond myself. The stranger next to me, the murmurings in my own body, the music that travels through the walls. This sound, in other words, creates a body that is not only this table, this hand, my body, and your body, but all of this together. And therefore, it composes a body that is always more than myself. Sound is a type of stranger that bypasses me, but also forgets me. It moves into me and out of me. In considering these ideas and formulations, we might ask, what consequences does this relational body have for us? What does this relational body of sound then produce or enable? What happens within this space of crowdedness in the moment of listening? So I want to continue a little bit by detouring or traveling through a number of kind of theoretical references that might help us along the way. So I return us to the work of Marshall McLuhan, remember him, and in particular his publication Understanding Media from 1962, so long ago. McLuhan develops an analysis of contemporary electronic media, at least at that time, and how it specifically brings us toward what he calls an acoustical or oral condition. For McLuhan, electronic media functions to distribute the body and our senses into networked relations. We are suddenly connected according to an immaterial production of flows of information and data, but also of sensory experiences. Interestingly, McLuhan defines this shift according to sound in what he calls an acoustical paradigm, that the electronic age organizes the world according to the transmission of messages, a flow of presence, a continual movement of information, characteristics that are suggestive of the acoustical, of sound as a form of propagation and also decentered subjectivity. In a way, McLuhan suggests that we rely more on an oral structure, a system that encourages individual expressions, what he calls the spoken over the written, and which circulates those expressions in a process of giving narrative, of course, to a greater number of people. So in a way, maybe McLuhan relocates the topic back to the body, back to the subject. McLuhan further describes network society as he famously calls an extended nervous system. Electronic media and the network structure are not only about what we perceive or receive, but also about the effective ways in which media moves through our bodies, something that Tiziana Terranova would elaborate to the idea of affective vibration. So already we are back to a kind of sonic metaphor. I read McLuhan's work then as pointing toward the relational body of sound that I'm outlining here, by recognizing in our contemporary media landscape an expression of acoustical relationality. Accordingly, the relational body of sound comes to function as a type of model for how to describe and understand network culture, and possibly how to navigate a society of global intensity. How listening might be said to be required in order to contend with the possibilities and problematics of global relations. So McLuhan's ideas are further developed in the work of Walter Ong, also working throughout the 1960s. Ong developed a compelling body of work in which sound and the question of listening feature. In particular, Ong shifts McLuhan's ideas toward that of the metaphysical, describing the intensities of global relations through the image of what he called the sound world, which for him is the I-thou world, where through the mysterious interior resonance, which sound best of all provides, persons commune with persons, reaching one another's interiors. So Ong emphasizes and almost obsesses over this question of interiority. And in this regard, in a way, it could be said to extend our notion of sound as a relational body. What we may take from Ong is an intensification of this notion. Returning to the event of sound, we can appreciate how a sound is not only the contact between two things meeting, a friction, but also more. That the quality of a sound is shaped by the inherent physical attributes of those things. What we hear is both the event of things coming into contact, as well as the intrinsic material properties constituting those things. My hand tapping the table sounds the way it does because of the qualities of my hand and of the table as material forms and things. That the interior of these objects or things, in a way, is exposed in the event of sound. We, of course, can also relate this very much to a certain kind of emotional register in the voice. I hear the inner properties of these things as they resound and propagate as they come out. For Walter Ong, sound is also a type of network, yet one that leads us to an intensity of interiority, an effective maze of involvement, a dramatic presencing that seems to foster also the capacity for empathy. We might also characterize this, as Pauline Oliveros does, through the notion of deep listening. Following Oliveros, there is a type of commingling we experience when listening. The event of sound and moving from these objects to these bodies, from the interior of one to the interior of another, produces an experience of mutuality, of what she might call the global interaction, and what we might also describe as radical sharing. Is not sound a sort of shared event, a common property, a collective body, a body maybe at odds with identity, an assembly in whose gathering interiorities and exteriorities interweave? In occupying the space between things, might sound be considered free of ownership? The relational body of sound, therefore, upsets a notion of subjectivity as pre-existing others, as sovereign. Rather, subjectivity is elaborated as a relational intensity, that which is passed around, and which is also, therefore, always already incomplete and interdependent. The philosopher David Michael Levin suggests this point in his book, The Listening Self. For Levin, listening is always a listening to the other. It is the making of a space for inclusion, this notion of empathy, and importantly, a space that includes that which is fundamentally different from myself. On some level, listening is a form of generosity by which we bend ourselves to meet each other. It is an act of welcome, of encouragement. Listening literally invites someone else to speak. We might say that listening is what we do to set the conditions for sharing. The relational body of sound, the commingling of interiors, and the network society are therefore expressions of sharing on different levels, which fundamentally positions sound and the acoustical as extremely relevant contemporary terms. Sound provides a model, or what we might call a vehicle, for creating a relational body, a body that is suggestive also for certain social possibilities, an ethics formed by the matters of listening. To listen, I would say then, changes what our body is, what constitutes it and its struggles, by inviting intrusion, interruption, and the joy of suffering what we do not know. So finally, I want to just move quickly to another kind of perspective then, following upon this suffering, of listening as a deep form of attention, of interiors, to further then consider the topic of noise. In short, to highlight this relational body of sound as a fundamental experience of intensity and also of fragmentation. As Stephen Connor describes, he says, the self defined in terms of hearing rather than sight is a self imaged not as a point but as a membrane, not as a picture but as a channel through which voices, noises, and musics travel. This description underscores the conditions of a heightened sensitivity I've been also exploring. The listening self is a self open to its surroundings, to others, to the movements of bodies and objects, and to the force of contact. It is always already integrated into an assembly which is more than itself, and in this regard is prone to commingling as well as fragmentation, rupture, and deep unease. The exposure McLuhan speaks of and the communication of interiors Aum describes must also contain a dramatic intensity, what we might call also a deep vulnerability. If sound exposes us, if it passes through us, to bring us into relation with others, it must be understood to create not only the conditions for empathy and intimacy, of deep attention, but also that of interruption and interference, threat and danger. In other words, listening is a type of risk, where sound may also intrude and annoy. The sound that comes into me, that invades my body, may also hurt. It may break me apart. It may agitate and frustrate. It may unsettle this body in that moment of hearing. This other, in fact, that may be too much. In entering into acoustical relations, the assembly of contacts and frictions, and the propagations that pass between and through things, one is put into a position of tensed encounter, an acoustics of power, of course, and also the drama of relations, of mutation. The relational body of sound, then, can also be a monstrous body, a body that collects together pieces of sound to move through the environment and to finally overwhelm us. In other words, sound may work to integrate us within a space of things that are foreign to us, and that in fact may challenge the familiarity of myself. In following these thoughts, I hope we have arrived at a deeper understanding of the behavior of sound and the events that introduce us into the intensities of listening as a relational experience. Here, what we understand as the body is more than its visual or physical outline. It is more than this shape here of my corporeal objectness, or even the identities we sometimes work so hard to foster. Rather, the body is flexed and pressed by an array of intensities, vibrations, resonances, and voices, which opens up possibilities for relating to or confronting others, especially that which is furthest from myself. I would suggest then that the relational body of sound is fundamentally the beginning of a possible community, a way of thinking or orienting community as being constituted by the incomplete, by interruption, and by the fragment. If speaking and hearing each other are fundamental to shaping community, to working through the concerns we hold in common, then engaging in acoustical paradigm might assist in fostering conditions of trust, responsibility, care, without corralling the life of togetherness into a shape of the familiar and the agreeable. Here we might arrive at a kind of emergent ethics of community as the working through of the noise of sociality, which must also include that which I have nothing in common with. In other words, recognition beyond recognition. I don't know if you heard the question. How do you define noise in an acoustical paradigm? I guess on some level, I'm very interested in noise as being that which is out of place. So of course we could say that a noise is only a noise according to its context. So the classic, if I remember correctly, the classic model of communication, noise is what interrupts the signal from origin to reception. So it interrupts the signal. Now you might say, well, that's also a very interesting opportunity. What then arises within this static may in fact have meaning. So what distinguishes it from the message has to be a context, has to be a particular system of language or code, representation, in which we can say, that is not the message, but something in excess of the message. So I'm very much interested in that excess and what that might enable in terms of a communicational model. So noise I take very seriously as an opportunity to engage with that which is out of place. Yeah. So, and that could be, that could be elaborated to understand what out of place means. Whether we talk about social abilities and actual encounters with strangers, or the unfamiliar or the unknown, which could also, of course, be things to do with the migrant and the exile or the alien. Or, of course, going back to language, what does it mean to also not understand? Particularly, I think, within our global relations, even here, how many languages are in this room? I don't know, but we could imagine there's more than one, for sure. So, again, extending beyond speech noise can be very valuable in showing us possibilities for how to speak across and through the complexities of languages. So noise can maybe be a creative tool for extending my mouth and what it's doing now. If I elaborate my voice in different ways, then I'm also participating, or I'm exploring the communicativeness of my voice. There's a mic going on. Hi.
I hope I got this right.
Yeah.
In regard to the unaccountable traveling of sound through environment and practice to the listener.
Can you press the button
Yeah.
until the end? Yeah, of course.
Hey. I was saying, in regard to the unaccountable traveling of sound through environmental factors to the listener, how does the listener take accountability of these unknown factors? And if not accountability, how do you see the impact? How do you see the impact of this factor on relationships or communication?
So the accountability of the listener.
For the unknown factors from the environmental situation, so the sound, the way that the sound morphs from the source to the listener.
That's, well, maybe, there are many architects in this room, maybe. That could be an approach in terms of accountability, or are you...
But I think I'm interested in from the act of listening.
Yeah. Well, lately I was trying to explore the idea of the possibility of listening as a form of activism, and we tried a couple experiments in different contexts with in different kind of workshop situations in a number of cities now, and there's always this moment where, so the structure is to, as a small group, going to very specific locations in the city, often related to certain contestations or struggles particular to the local context. So going to these sites and thinking, well, how might our listening be a form of activism within this context? And there's always this moment, we talk afterwards. It's very much also introducing the possibility of listening, and what that might enable. So there's always a moment of just responding to that, reflecting on what we experienced. And often we start very much by talking about what our experience was, how we received the sound. So it might be, I heard these things, and through listening to the environment, I slowly became tuned in to certain relationships or certain dynamics within the environment. So it's very receptive, very sensitive, like sensitizing oneself to the environment around it, which is very important, very fundamental. And then, if you push that, and we go around the room and we kind of keep talking, then there's always a moment where this needs to change, and it's to say, well, how does my listening impact the environment? Not only how the environment is impacting me as a listener, but what does my listening do to the environment? And I'm not sure we arrive so often at a concrete answer to that, but it is a proposition that I'm exploring and trying to work through. So some of this has led to a question about agency, what I've called sonic agency. So how we also develop types of agency through an acoustical paradigm or through the experiences of listening we have. This, of course, can embolden us or enliven certain demands or struggles or wishes or possibilities in terms of enacting onto certain contexts or environments. So, I mean, the question, I guess, of accountability, this is interesting. I hadn't quite thought about it through that lens. But of course, yes, I mean, if you start from this position of an act, of a form of enactment that listening might be, then this again maybe brings us back to certain context, certain questions about, well, what is it that I'm contending with in this particular situation? So, I mean, we could reflect upon the space that we are in now and think, well, we are listening, so what is your accountability to my voice right now? We could say that could be quite powerful question in a way, because in a way I'm only really speaking in a sense because you are looking at me. So you are in a way beckoning me to speak. So I'm speaking. So my voice in a way is your product. It's your doing. So this is part of it. I mean, the relationality needs to be then arriving at this crowd, the distributed body. So accountability, yes, is quite strong maybe in that framework. To say maybe accountability, also responsibility, then as a listener, to understand that my listening is impacting on things around me, on each other. So what kind of listening then do I perform? Listening is not just one type of listening. There are many kinds of listenings. So whether it's deep or shallow, expanded or contracted. So it's a very good question, thank you.
I was curious about what you said about agency and relationality, and I guess in relation to this communism idea of individuals and collectives. In terms of, I think we've mostly been speaking of sound in terms of not purely, but in certainly a kind of communication, have the message, a sender, a receiver, a perceiver, a kind of line between bodies or between things and forming that kind of relation. I wonder if you have any thoughts on sound in terms of resonance and frequency, in terms of something that was less of a discrete communicative message and more of a continuous kind of something that is shared between bodies, and maybe it's not, I guess the obvious analogy is to like the kind of the frequency that causes a vibration in the resonant frequency of a room or something like that causes causes things to not help but vibrate, or but something like which is, I guess, kind of another analogy in like an effective kind of atmosphere or something that really raises the temperature for everything within a common space. So I wasn't very articulate, but yeah.
No, I think you mapped it out very well. Yes. These are absolutely things that are essential and right into the heart of sound. So, I mean, I am sort of, it is kind of a general usage of the word sound that I'm kind of using right now. Sound in general, but of course, sound, is already constituted by a range of elements, frequencies, and certain dynamics, and that are already very relational. In terms of, if we go back to the simple example of acoustics, what what in a way becomes the distribution of the herd is very dependent on its acoustical parameters. And so the distribution of the herd, of course, is also a question about space, a question about power, we could even say. And that very much shapes, even on the level of frequency, what gets heard and what doesn't, or what we hear and what we don't, and how we also utilize that as a capacity, whether we feel we have a place here or a sense of belonging, can also come down to a question of frequency, or as you point out, resonance. What the distribution of my voice or the sense that that gives me in terms of my ability to participate is very fundamental to shaping ideas about community or just simply daily practices of getting through life. So these are all very, very important perspectives that you point at. And in a way, I would sort of, as I'm already suggesting, I'm sort of already tempted to understand this politically, which I think is something, if we come back to the topic of agency and the essential, fundamental, feeling that we have around being heard, around the experiences of being heard.
Well, one of the ideas behind the Swamp Pavilion was really sort of like to take seriously this notion of Bertolt Brecht. When he said that radio is the worst network of pipes, and then he added, it's not only listening but also transmitting, right? So to paraphrase, it's both, right? Like the pipe has the two ends, not only transmitting but also listening. And I was thinking, how your input actually wonderfully resonates with the one of Doyne, in terms of she uses these intricate diagrams that map or envision choreography of the movement of the bodies or agencies, right, in the urban environment. And while you're addressing the sound, sort of like that emanates from the bodies, right, or from the things, it's also about kind of like how the space can be choreographed, So in one case, we're talking about the choreography of that comes from some kind of like diagrams, the diagrammatic schemes. And here we have the diagrammatic schemes that sort of like comes from the sound. And I think in both instances they speak to this idea of organizational aesthetics. So, thank you for that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I was also very much thinking back to her last image with the arrows jumping through Paris, which immediately reminded me right away of Naked City, Guy Debord and Asger Jorn's Naked City map of Paris as a constitution or as a constellation of fragments. So I saw it as a sonic image, her last slide, which is very much also about a certain ambient architecture. So I think I'm also very much interested in sound as an ambient agent through which certain solidarities can be elaborated that produce a very different kind of picture. So I was very inspired by her thinking.
I was actually thinking about community, because I had two senses of community actually of the presentation before, and because it seemed to me more in the order of the identity, and these other communities of an order of radical differences, right? Like how do I? And then I'm just thinking about what community is and what is community and commons, because this is like community also. So like community as an identitary process, and so the commons is of course something that we recognize as commons, or are the commons as sound, for example, something that doesn't be recognized by community. It is something, and it's an relation for maybe a system of relations that is beyond myself. It's just so it's funny because I saw them separate or opposites or opposing another sense of community. And then I have to think about collectivity and community as well, or how much inclusiveness or exclusiveness is in the making of community. What kind of community? That's questions.
Well, maybe we should sort of like suspend this question in the year and continue the discussion on the break. And now, well, thank you, Brandon, and
Thank you.
after